Welcome to another session of discussion whereby we will be touching about the bones of the lower extremity. Remember, we are still under the topic of appendicular skeleton. At that time of the previous discussion, we were able to identify the bones of the upper extremity, and these are the bones of the pectoral girdle, the bones of the upper arm, forearm, and the hands. So today, without much ado, let's move ahead. Welcome to another session of discussion whereby we will be able to identify the bones of the lower extremity, just like the other time whereby we were able to learn about bones of the upper extremity. Remember, we are still under the topic of appendicular skeleton, and please remember to subscribe and follow up on our channel by Yan Medi. Without much ado, let's move ahead. On the introduction part, we have each lower limb skeleton consists of 31 bones which form two distinct regions, the pelvic girdle and the free lower limb. And under the lower limb, we have thigh, leg, and foot. So let's consider this image here, which is just but an overview of the bones of the lower extremity. We have the part labeled as A. This is referred to as the pelvic girdle, which is made up with the bone of the hip and as well the sacrum. So we will not be able to talk much about the sacrum because it's part of the exoskeleton. But regardless of that, we will find out that sacrum contributes to the part of bony pelvis, which is just a different description about the bones of the lower extremity. So the part labeled A, as said, is the pelvic girdle. Moving to B, we have the thigh, which begins from this region right immediately after pelvic girdle. Moving down here, we have the patella, which forms part of the thigh. We have this long bone, which is known as the femur. Then moving to the part labeled C, these are the bones of the leg. According to strict anatomical description, it's known as the leg. The bones of the leg includes the fibula, labeled as 5, and 6, we have the tibia. And finally, the part labeled as D, we have the tarsal bones, we have the metatarsal, and the phalanges labeled as 9. So with this bone, we as well have the articulation between each other, or articulation with other bones, and beginning from the part labeled as 10 or marked as 10 forms the joint known as the sacroiliac joint, the joint formed between the hip bone and the sacrum. We as well have the part labeled as 11, which is the pubic symphysis. This is where the two hip bone joins together anteriorly. We as well have the part labeled as 12. This is the hip joint, the joint formed between the bones of the thigh and the bone of the hip. So we have as well the part labeled as 13, and this is the knee joint. 14, with regard to its anatomy, is known as the proximal tibiofibular joint, and the part labeled as 15 is the distal tibiofibular joint, while 16 is the ankle joint. 17, we have the talocalcaneonavicular joint, and the part labeled as 18 is the tarsometatarsal joint. Then 19, we have metatarsal phalangeal joint, and finally the part labeled as 20 is the interphalangeal joint. Remember, we are only dealing with bones, and when we will come to the topic of joints, we will be able to have a deep or advanced description on them as well. So moving ahead, we'll begin with the hip bone. So with us, the hip or pelvic girdle consists of two hip bones, also called corsal bones or os corsi. So all these names, they just refer to one thing, which is the pelvic girdle or the hip bone. The hip bones unite anteriorly at a joint called pubic symphysis, of which we were able to identify from our previous image. which is this is the part labeled as pubic symphysis, and we are told that while posteriorly with the sacrum at the sacroiliac joint, and the same joint we have right here, the part labeled as 10. We have the part labeled as 10 at the sacroiliac joint. This is the point of reference. The complete ring, composed of the hip bones, pubic symphysis, and sacrum, forms a deep basin-like structure called the bony pelvis. So we have now the structure bony pelvis apart from the pelvic girdle. Remember, these are two different things. So the bony pelvis, now this other bone comes in, which is the sacrum. And remember, sacrum is part of the exoskeleton, but when it comes to the description of bony pelvis, we have to include it with these other bones of the pelvic, which is the hip bones, and the joint at anterior aspect of the hip bone, which is the pubic symphysis. So functionally, the bony pelvis provides a strong and stable support for the vertebral column and pelvic as well, and the lower abdominal organ. So it's for support and as well a protective case for the abdominal organ. The pelvic girdle of the bony pelvis also connects the bones of the lower limb to the exoskeleton. So that's the basic function of the hip bone or the pelvic girdle. We have an image to as well give the description or to illustrate what we have been talking about. We have the sacroiliac joint, and as well we have the sacral promontory, we have the right hip bone, we have the sacrum, the posterior aspect, we have the pubic symphysis. So this fibrocartilage kind of joint. We have the obturator foramen. Foramens are hole within a bone. We have the acetabulum. We will be talking about the acetabulum, and we can be able to link with the image that we have here. We have the pelvic brim, this bony surface known as the pelvic brim. Each of the two hip bones of a newborn consists of 3 bones separated by cartilage, and the 3 bones are here. Can be able to identify. We have the ilium, we have the ischium, and we have the pubis. But regardless of them being 3, they are fused. They fused form just one bone known as the hip bone. So the 3 bones separated by cartilage are separated by cartilage, and these are the superior ilium, an inferior and anterior pubis, and an inferior and posterior ischium. So this is just but anatomical description of where they are found within the hip. So by the age of 23, the 3 separate bones fuse together. So that's what we were talking during our first discussion on the ossification of bones, and we were able to also understand by the age of 23, nearly all bones of the body will or have ossified. So this is the same as applied to this, the bone of the hip. So let's start with the bony of the ilium. Let's know what's basic function or what are the anatomical or surface structure found on ilium, whether marking, whether the depressions or the lines or the grooves. So let's consider what the ilium has, of the bone ilium has. So we have here, the ilium is the largest of the 3 components of the hip bone. It is thicker near the hip joint and expands into a large curved plate of bone superiorly. A superior wing and an inferior body comprise the ilium. The body is one of the components of the acetabulum. So acetabulum, what is acetabulum? So this is the socket for the head of femur, and when the head of femur comes into contact with acetabulum, we have this joint known as the hip joint. Iliac crest is superior border of the ilium, and many of the abdominal muscles originate here. So we will be able to check both the ilium, the acetabulum, and as well as these other structures whereby we are going to learn. The iliac crest, just described above, ends anteriorly in a blunt anterior superior iliac spine, which is also denoted as ASIS, which anchors the sartorius and the inguinal ligament. So this blunt anterior superior iliac spine, it's a place, it's a surface whereby it anchors this sartorius, which is the longest muscle, just to brief you, and the inguinal ligament found on the anterior aspect, just at the inguinal area there. Below this spine is a blunt projection, also known as the anterior inferior iliac spine, denoted as AIIS, where straight head of rectus femoris originates. So all these other descriptions are the muscles which originate from the structure or from the surface feature of ilium named above, such as the anterior superior iliac spine. We have the sartorius and the inguinal ligament, and as well we have the anterior inferior iliac spine, and this is where the straight head of rectus femoris originates. So these are just butt muscles of the body. Posteriorly, the iliac crest ends in a sharp posterior superior iliac spine. So the names as well, they refer to where these structures are found. For the first two, we have anterior, while the last two which I'm talking about are found on the posterior aspect of the ilium. So as well as the anterior superior iliac spine and the anterior inferior iliac spine, the posterior superior iliac spine serves as an attachment of gluteal maximus muscle. So those are just butt muscle. Below this spine is a sharp projection of posterior inferior iliac spine again. And this partially anchors sacrotuberous ligament, which serves to bind the sacrum to the os causae. Generally, the spine serves as a point of attachment for the tendons of the muscles and ligaments of the trunk, hip, and thigh. So this pinous process of the spine found on the ilium are where generally the muscles and the tendons, and as well as the ligaments of the trunk, hip, and thigh originates. So let's just consider the detailed image of the ilium and also link the areas just mentioned above where they are found. So this is the medial aspect, a detailed image of the hip bone. With us here, we have the iliac fossa. This is the medial aspect. So when we will be considering on the lateral aspect, we will be able to identify other features which we have not just mentioned or whatever we have been mentioning. So we have the acute line. We will know what's the acute line, but let's begin with the most top or the superior aspect of ilium. We have this curved region of which I just talked about, where most of the abdominal muscles originate. We have that's known as the iliac crest, as mentioned. We as well have the anterior superior iliac spine right here, this projection. We have the iliac fossa. We have the anterior inferior iliac spine down just below the anterior superior iliac spine. Moving to this other side, we have the body of ilium. We have the greater sciatic notch. We will know, or we will be able to understand what's greater sciatic notch, what's its basic function. So we as well have the posterior inferior iliac spine. We as well have the posterior superior iliac spine, and we also have the surface known as the auricular surface, and finally the iliac tuberosity. This is the lateral detailed view of the ilium and other innermate bones. We have this part, anterior superior iliac spine, as mentioned. We have the anterior inferior iliac spine. We have the ala, or the body of ilium, right here. The other side, or the medial side, is known as the fossa. But while coming to the lateral side, we have the ala of the body. We have the iliac crest, the curved region. We have the gluteal lines beginning from the anterior. We have the inferior right here, and we have the posterior gluteal line. And we all have the posterior superior iliac spine and the posterior inferior iliac spine. And this here is the greater sciatic notch. So below the posterior inferior iliac spine is the greater sciatic notch. Through this, the sciatic nerve passes, and this is the nerve which is the largest nerve in the body. So let's just go back to our image and check where this greater sciatic notch is found. So this is the stuff. We have here the greater sciatic notch, just like a depression. We as well have on the lateral view the greater sciatic notch, where the sciatic nerve passes through. The medial surface of the ilium contains the iliac fossa, a concavity where the tendon of the iliacus muscle attaches. So the iliac fossa we were able to identify from the medial surface, but we can still go back to the image and review where this iliac fossa is found, so that you can be able to have that link with the real image. So this is the medial aspect. We have the iliac fossa right here. So this is the depression which I was just talking about. Posterior to this fossa are the iliac tuberosity, a point of attachment for the sacroiliac ligament. So the ligament also attaches to iliac tuberosity. The auricular surface which articulates with the sacrum to form the sacroiliac joint. So we have the iliac tuberosity, and as well we have the auricular surface, whereby the auricular surface is the point of attachment to the sacrum that forms the sacroiliac joint. So let's consider back to our image, where these surface are found, the basic anatomy of the ilium. So we have the iliac tuberosity, and let me just go to the so we have the iliac tuberosity here, and we have the auricular surface here. So this is the medial view of the bony of the bone of the hip, sorry, but we are just dealing with the part of the ilium. So when we will be moving to other parts, we will be able to review as well where do this structure which we are talking about are found. Projecting anteriorly and inferiorly from the auricular surface, a ridge of bone called the arcuate line. So the arcuate line as well, can still go back and check the arcuate line. So we have the arcuate line just projecting here. This is a ridge of bone. Move it down to this other side. So that's all about the surface structure of ilium. But you can as well check on this other surface marking of the structure. So the other conspicuous marking of the ilium are the three arced line on its lateral surface called the posterior gluteal line, the anterior gluteal line, and the inferior gluteal line as well. The gluteal muscles attach the ilium between these lines. So let's just consider back to our image and check where do these gluteal lines are found, because they're so important because of the gluteal muscle attached between these lines. So we have the three lines, the anterior gluteal line, we have the inferior gluteal line, and we as well have the posterior gluteal line. Let's move to the other bone, just as mentioned. We have the ischium. The inferior and posterior portion of the hip bone is where the ischium is found, between the body of the ilium and the inferior ramus of the pubis. So when we will be dealing with the pubis, we will as well consider where is basically ischium found. So the ischium is a sideways arced or U-shaped structure with its concave notched margin contributing to the posterior two-thirds of the obturator foramen. And as said earlier on, the large hole on the anterior surface of the hip is known as the obturator foramen. So this is just but images demonstrating or showing where this ischium is found. So we have this surface is the ischium. So we have its as well. We have the two-third contribution of ischium to obturator foramen. It's attached to the pubis, and as well it's connected to the ilium right here, and we as well have the acetabulum. This is the bone of, maybe it was extracted from someone who died long time ago, and you can as well check from this image, which is the real image, the acetabulum. We have the ischium projecting down here, and we have the pubis here, and as well we have the structures of which we were able to identify from the previous bone, which is the ilium. We have the anterior superior iliac spine. We as well have the ilium. So this is just but an image of bone which was taken from someone or from dead tissue. Let me just consider it that way. So the ischium is comprised of superior body and an inferior ramus, which is in plural as rami. The ramus joins the pubis. So this is where the ischium joins the pubis, the point known as the ramus. Features of the ischium include the prominent ischial spine, a lesser sciatic notch below the spine, and a rough and thickened ischial tuberosity. So just as the other bone which we were able to talk about, which has some tuberosity, yeah, as well we have the ischium also has a tuberosity. And just to mention about this, it's possibly the point where some muscles originates, or where tendons might be attaching to. So together the ramus and the pubis surround the obturator foramen. Okay, the foramen is so named because despite the fact blood vessel and nerves pass through it, it's nearly completely closed by fibrous obturator membrane. So the hole which is found in the bone, it's okay, it's a hole, but it's just covered by a membrane which is called the obturator membrane. And yeah, we have the blood vessels and nerves which pass through it. So when we will be reading in advance about the anatomy of human body, we will be able to understand which blood vessels or which nerves pass through these holes found on bone. So let's consider the ischium right here. We have the body, is mentioned, the body of ischium. We have the ischial spine. We have the lesser sciatic notch. We have the ischial tuberosity, and we have the ramus of ischium, which is just connected to the bone pubis. We have the inferior ramus of pubis as well, like the one of ischium. With us, we also have the acetabular notch connected. It's found on ilium, and that's all about the ischium. Maybe if someone else has anything to say or to talk about the ischium, can as well add on the comment box. So the other one was lateral side, or the lateral view, while this other one is the medial view. So you can as well consider this image, and let's check what's found on the medial aspect or the medial view of the ischium. We have the body of the ischium, we have the ischial spine, we have the lesser sciatic notch, we have the obturator foramen, whereby we were able to understand that ischium contributes to two-thirds of the obturator foramen. We have the ischial tuberosity, and we have the ramus of ischium. Okay, let's move to the other bone, which is the pubis. The pubis is the inferior anterior portion of the hip bone, and like the ischium, has the form of a sideways arc or a U shape. A superior ramus, an inferior ramus, and a body. Between the ramus comprise the pubis. The anterior superior border of the body is the pubic crest, and at its lateral end is a projection called the pubic tubercle. This tubercle is the beginning of a raised line known as the pectineal line. Remember when we were talking about the other bone, which is the ischium? Not ischium, actually it was the ILIUM. We were able to identify the accurate line. Well, on this, we can be able to see the pectineal line. And of course, we have the description right here, which extends superiorly and laterally along the superior ramus to merge with the accurate line of the ilium right here. Thank you, because it's already pointed out. This line is one important landmark for distinguishing the superior, which is the false, and inferior, which is the true portions of the bony pelvis. Remember how the true pelvis and the false pelvis. I have just been able to identify that, and with me, we will just check them as we will be proceeding with our topic. So keep on following, and you'll be able to be added some point on the true and the false pelvis. So just as the other bones, let's consider this detailed medial view of the hip bone, and let's now move to the part of the pubis. We have the pectineal line, we have the superior ramus of the pubis, we have the body of the pubis here, and its contribution to obturator foramen. We have the pubic tubercle here, we have the pubic crest, pubic symphysis, and the inferior ramus of pubis down here. This is the lateral detailed part, and we can as well identify the structures. We have the inferior ramus of pubis, we have the obturator foramen, we have the pubic tubercle, we have the superior ramus of pubis, and its contribution as well to the acetabulum of the acetabular fossa. This as well, like the other images, and this dead tissue or the bone extracted from someone passed away a long time ago. So we have the structure, the obturator foramen, we have the obturator groove, we have the ischial spine, lesser sciatic notch, we have the pubic symphysis here, we have the greater sciatic notch, we have the auricular surface, preauricular sulcus, we have the posterior inferior iliac spine, and the other structures just found on bone. You can be able to identify for your own. Yeah, right here. So the pubic symphysis is the joint between the pubis of the two hip bones, and that's anteriorly. It consists of disc of fibrocartilage. Inferior to this joint, the inferior rami of the two pubic bones converged from the pubic arc. So that's just about the description about the pubic symphysis and the bone and the hip bone in general. So let's now consider specific structure, as acetabulum. So the acetabulum is a deep fossa formed by the ilium, ischium, and pubis. So let's just say the fossa formed by the three intimate bones. Its function, it functions as a socket that accepts the round head of the femur. Together, the acetabulum and the femoral head forms the hip or the corsal joint. I just mentioned this on in the beginning of this discussion, So I was able to identify the acetabulum from the hip bone, and also as well explained to you what its function, whereby it accepts the rounded head of the femur, and this is now known as the hip joint. On the inferior side of the acetabulum, a deep indentation which is the acetabular notch, forms a foramen through which blood vessels and nerve passes. So we were able to identify the acetabular fossa from the images which I just posted above. So the acetabular notch also serves as a point of attachment for ligament of the femur called ligament of the head of femur. So this just a description about the acetabulum. So we have the image right here. We have the acetabular fossa or the notch. We have the lunate surface. So this is where the head of the femur comes into contact with the hip bone.